Man, something's really got to give because those two factors, supply can't keep up with it. And remember, I assume that supply would compound at a rate that I think it cannot do. So you want to know the punchline, right? The bottom line is I'm more bullish on silver the next decade than I was in the previous decade. That's the bottom line. I don't think that silver's really got a ways to go over the next decade. It's more favorable dynamics than gold. And I always get joked, a few jokes pushed at me about it being the poor man's gold and all that. And I always like to hit back kind of hard because, you always hear about silver being undervalued and all the things that you hear, and that only the really smart people buy gold. But that's funny because it's the billionaires that bought silver at the right time. Mr. Buffett, his friend Mr. Gates, George Soros, and a few of my friends here in Europe bought silver along with the billionaires at the right time, by the way. So where are we now? We're on an inflation-adjusted place that's still low. Are we in a bubble? No. No, we're not in a bubble. A bubble, by my definition, is a 10-bagger. In other words, a 10-fold increase. These dots over here, and this is a bit confusing, that's silver and that's gold. We're up about 400% on gold and silver when this chart was made not very long ago. You look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you're up in here. You're looking at the 1980 bubble, you're up in here. You want to go to the South Sea Island bubble, it's up here. I mean, we are not in a bubble. The bubble, as many of my colleagues has explained, isn't gold and silver. Gold and silver 1-ounce coins or bars or whatever you want to think of have the same mass always and everywhere throughout the entire universe. They don't change. So what is the bubble? The bubble is the fiat currency system. That's the bubble. This conundrum is the biggest one in financial history, and it will go into the record books. So I had to throw this in for Ned. That's our ultimate indicator. People have asked me again and again, when do I know, when do I know, when do I know? Remember, they want to know the exact price, the exact date, and the exact time. So I came up with this. When the Queen is serving burgers at McDonald's, that's the top, okay? Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for Q&A. Gentleman there with a red tie.
Thank you very much. My question to you, haven't said anything about the Morgan HSBC short position and how that's going to be resolved and the rest of it. I see what the CFTC has recently done, and that seems to be just covering up the business and shuffling it offshore, the rest of it. How do you see it being resolved and when? And indeed, a further question would be, have any of these recent settlements on the COMEX had to be in cash settlements as opposed to delivery? And if they were cash settlements, what sort of premium would they have to have gone at? Thank you.
Okay. Double compound question with a twist of lime. Thank you. I have to make a presupposition here because we don't have time, but he's talking about all these lawsuits about the silver market manipulation, primarily J.P. Morgan, and what's my take. My take's a bit different than some of the other commentators. I'm very glad that it's in the fore. I'm glad it's in public discussion, and I'm very grateful to see the lawsuits. I hold much too cynical a view to think that they'll do much good. One, the amount of legislation that is absolutely required to put these guys behind bars already exists. You do not need any more, and yet there's been a blind eye to it the whole time through. Secondly, as you alluded to, the statement has been put out already that the hedgers, legitimate hedgers, are exempt. So what's the point? The point right now is if they're exempt in the current contract, that the new one is going to exempt them again. It's a pointless, moot issue. It's just an absolute worthless exercise in my view, other than bringing attention to the problem. Lastly, the reason I've never gotten extremely emotional about the issue is because I do believe in free markets. And eventually, the amount of silver that's required that cannot be pushed through either by paper or a settlement by cash will clog the system. And when the default happens, it won't be called a default. They'll have some new name for it, but it will happen. I've always maintained that someday the physical demand will trump the paper price of silver. We've already witnessed that a couple of times, and it's a precursor to what I see in the future. So I'm very steadfast that the physical market will have its day. Whether or not the manipulators get to pay their dues or not, I don't know, but I do know that the market itself will correct that issue eventually. The COMEX contracts that do get settled in cash are on a basis where both parties agree to that settlement. There are no COMEX settlements in cash that are because someone said, I can't deliver the silver, will you take cash instead? Now, by contract, if the clearinghouse cannot produce a physical delivery, they can implement that you have to cash settle. But that's a different point. I want to make it very clear and very fine and very concise because I'm very precise in my work. But if I'm HSBC and I owe Morgan Stanley some silver and we agree to cash settle and we hold contracts against each other, that's okay as long as we agree, and it's fine. Could there be cash settlement outside of the system? And the answer, and it's very misunderstood, is an absolute 100% complete yes. That's the problem with the misunderstanding in the silver market, is so many pundits put out false information. Every lease contract that's out there could be settled for cash. Now, I'm not saying a jeweler would settle for cash, and I'm sure he wants his silver, but there's a weasel clause in almost all of them that you can settle in cash, which unfortunately doesn't amp up the physical problem that I keep talking about that will eventually cure this malady. It will happen anyway, but most of the lease markets can be cash settled. So that's different from the CME or the COMEX, which again can be cash settled in almost all circumstances.
Yes, hello, Mr. Morgan. I was just wondering if you could give an approximation in your mind as to what degree the spot purchase moved the price of silver in this latest run-up. Would you say it was largely responsible or only to a small degree?
Yeah, the spot was not largely responsible. It was what I learned, fortunately, after I got away from myself, meaning that having a pretty strong math background, I thought you could beat the market by math, and you can't. But you can beat it with psychology. And so it was psychological adding on, and then you hear about spot and all these things added together. It was the psychology that moved the market much more than the spot market demand, although it did play into it.
As far as I understand, the above-ground silver supply of 700 million ounces, it's only an estimate. No one really knows. So what if that number is vastly different to that 700 million ounces estimate? Surely that will have an effect on your projected price of silver and when it rises drastically.
It all boils down to supply and demand. I mean, pick a number. What is it, 10 times greater? Will it take 10 times longer? No. It's like asking, what's the proper price of gold to silver, as someone asked earlier. Platinum is 15 times rarer than gold. 15 times. Should it be 15 times the price? Well, should it? Well, you don't know. The market knows. The market knows more than all of us. That's why it's the market. So I don't care. I mean, look, when the rush goes, and it's already started, it's not a function of price. It's a function of psychology. How many people do you know that are going to say, gold's too expensive at $2,000 the ounce, I think I'll buy silver? Probably everybody in your neighborhood. I don't know where you live. I'm making a presupposition. I'm just trying to make the point. The point I'm trying to make is very simple. There's a lot more poor people than there are rich people. But everybody, in my view, in my study, has a financial survival mechanism, just like a survival mechanism. And when their financial survival mechanism clicks in, because they've been conned, they're going to go to whatever they can get. And that's what a currency crisis is all about. It's I want anything except the US dollar. And that is a monetary phenomenon. And that, from the gentleman over here that asked me, could happen tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. That cannot be predicted. It cannot be predicted on the amount of currency. We have enough currency to have a global hyperinflation in 12 milliseconds. It's there. It's a psychological phenomenon that you cannot put down. None of us are smart enough to know when. But be prepared, because once it happens, you can't. It's like jumping off a cliff. You can't say, "Uh-oh, I made a mistake." Once it happens, it happens.